Have you ever seen a movie that you absolutely loved? Then a few years later, a sequel came out, and you got really excited because you loved the movie, and you went to see the sequel, and you walked out saying, not only was that the worst movie I've ever seen, it ruined the first movie for me too. Because a lot of the times when you go and see the sequel, it just almost never matches up to the first one. In fact, I would say probably, I don't know, maybe 90% of the sequels that Hollywood puts out are poor decisions by them. And the reason that is because usually a really good movie tells a really good story and finishes the story. And since the story is done, they don't need to tell it anymore or tell it again. One of these great examples is Bill and Ted. Right? How many of you remember Bill and Ted? Okay, Bill and if you're my age or around my age, you remember Bill and Ted. Excellent movie, right? But by the end of that movie, I was like, I like Bill and Ted. This has been fun, but I'm done with them now because you can only take so much of the, woo, dude. And somebody decided, let's ruin it by making a new movie. So we have Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which is way worse and kind of ruins the whole franchise. Every so often, a sequel gets it right. Like I think a lot of people believe that Rocky II is actually better than Rocky I. And most people would say that Empire Strikes Back is the best sequel Hollywood's ever made. The reason some sequels work is because the first movie left a little bit of the story to be told. And since there's a little bit left to be told, the sequel actually works. So this morning, we actually have a sequel. This is a sequel from Jesus, so we know it's going to be a good one. We've been working our way through Matthew 5, where Jesus is addressing some of the things we've heard, but then saying, hey, it's not really about what you do on the outside, it's about your heart. And last week he was talking about marriage and adultery and lust, and we said it's really about contentment. Today he's going to take that and give us a sequel. He's going to say, hey, there's a little bit left that needs to be told, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So remember how this works in this passage in Matthew 5. Jesus says, you have heard, which means you've been taught this by the Pharisees and the scribes. And then he says, but I say to you, which means he's now reinterpreting or remixing or unpacking, help us to see what it's really all about. So in week 1, he said, you've heard thou shalt not kill. And we all say, yes, that's good, you shouldn't kill. But he says, but I say to you, don't escalate conflict, seek reconciliation. And last week, he said, you've heard it say that don't commit adultery, but I say to you that a man who looks on a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery, which is to say, be content with what God has provided you. Don't go chasing after what the world offers. And so now this week, Jesus is going to build on that and continue with the theme of marriage. And so let's open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5 and see what Jesus has to say in kind of his discussion on marriage, part 2. This is Matthew 5:31. Jesus says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. So we're going to have to take a minute and explain a little bit of the culture here. All right? Jesus lived 2,000 years ago in a different part of the world than us. And so life was very different there. And here he's actually referencing Moses' law, which was almost 1,000 years before him, and in a culture and a time that really didn't know God, that didn't understand him. And so when Moses was giving the law to the people of Israel, that was a time and a place when women were essentially property. So if you were a daughter, you could count on the fact that you'd eventually be married to a man, not because you loved him or because you guys hit it off, but because your dad and maybe his dad or him struck some kind of a deal. And there was money transacted or goats or sheep or whatever, and then you were that man's property. Now the problem was, in that time, men could do whatever they wanted with their property. And so if you weren't a pleasing wife, if you didn't do what your husband wanted to do, he could just say, well, I'm done with you. That's it. And go find a new wife. But the problem for you is, what do you do now? Because you're still married to this guy. You're not allowed to go back to your family. And so you kind of just have to live in the shadows for the rest of your life. Not sure if you're going to be provided for, but knowing for sure that you're no longer the favored wife. And so into that culture, God speaks to his people. And he says, we're going to be a little bit different. And he gives them this rule that says, if you want to divorce your wife, if your wife isn't pleasing to you, then you have to give her a certificate of divorce. Now, if you skip ahead a couple chapters to Matthew 19, Jesus is teaching on marriage and divorce there as well because the Pharisees have asked him some questions. And what he explains there is that divorce was never God's intent. God doesn't want you to be divorced. When Moses wrote that, it wasn't because God desired it, it was because of the hardness of your hearts. Which is to say this, God recognized that men were abusing women in this situation. And so he created this rule, he created this law, not to give men an easy out, but to protect and empower women. Because you see, under Moses' law, if a woman's not pleasing to a man, he has to give her a certificate of divorce. He can't go out and find a new wife. He has to give the first wife a certificate of divorce, which now frees her to no longer be his property. And now she has choices, she has options. She can return to her family, she can strike out on her own, but she is no longer obligated to be his possession. And so God gave this law not because he wanted to, not because it was a good thing, but to protect and provide for women. So now Jesus is talking to the Pharisees in Matthew 5, and he says, you have heard it said that Moses said, hey, if you divorce your wife, give her a certificate. Now he's going to say, but there's more to that story, right? There's more to this. So verse 32, he says this, but I say to you, that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is one of those passages that we look at and say, ooh, this is a hard teaching, right? What is Jesus getting at here? He seems to be really putting a high standard out for people to live up with. Any divorce is adultery? Well, let's try to talk it through a little bit, all right? So Jesus is right, because adultery is essentially the breaking of the marriage covenant. And so any breaking of the marriage covenant is adultery. And Jesus said, I don't want you to break the marriage covenant. It's important. It's really important. So don't do it. And he's creating this super high standard that people are going to look at and say, whoa, what do we do with this? Now, let me pause for a second. I'm going to come back to that, but let me pause for a second, because this is a high standard, isn't it? You know, the thou shalt not kill, really low standard. We all do really well with that one, right? Last week it was like, whoever commits lust and adultery, yeah, we can stay away from that. This continues to get more and more personal, because we all recognize that divorce is a pretty prevalent part of our society. And it's something that touches almost every family in America in some way. So what do we do with this passage? Well, I want you to remember that this whole passage in Matthew 5 is ended with Jesus saying, be perfect as I am perfect. And we're reminded, wait a minute, Jesus, we're not perfect. We can't be perfect, because once you're not perfect, you can't get back and be perfect. So what do we do with that? But we're reminded that it's okay that we're not perfect, because none of us are perfect, because who is perfect? Jesus is. And he gives his perfection to us. And so as we read through each of these passages, we have to be reminded that none of us live up to this standard. But all of us can receive Jesus' perfection. All right, so sometimes in churches, we get this really, really wrong. All right? Especially when it comes to this issue of divorce. Because sometimes in churches, we treat divorce like it's the unpardonable sin. And once you've been divorced, or once you've experienced divorce, or someone in your family has experienced divorce, you get a black check mark on your forehead. And everybody's going to stay away from you because you're now a second-class citizen. That is a horrendous misunderstanding of grace. Because God's grace covers everything. We're given Jesus' perfection because of what he did on the cross. And he went to the cross for our lying, for our cheating, for our stealing, for our wrong thoughts, for our anger, for our revenge. And he went to the cross for our adultery and our divorce. And those are covered just as much as anything else. And so we who have experienced God's grace ought never not extend that same grace to those around us. So we don't ever want to be Christians who say, well, there's these sins over here, and then there's the big ones. Because there aren't any big ones. They're all covered by God's grace. Okay, so that's just course. Let's get back to our passage. Jesus is giving us a really high standard that none of us can meet, but Jesus meets it for us, right? All right, but what Jesus is really getting at here is our hearts, remember? In the first command, it was don't murder, but the heart of it is don't escalate conflict, seek reconciliation. And last week it was don't commit adultery, but the heart of it is be content with what God has provided. Don't chase after the world's distractions. And so now today, Jesus is saying don't get divorced. That's not God's plan. It's not God's desire. But there's something more at the heart of this, right? At the heart of this is that Jesus wants us to be people who are faithful. People who are faithful. And in faithfulness is important in a marriage, but it exists in other places as well, right? And so if we really look at this passage at the heart of what Jesus is saying, it's not just to those of us who are married. This is to everyone because Jesus expects and desires faithfulness from all of us. Now, when I say the word faithfulness, there's a picture that I always have in my mind of Emily the Beagle. Okay, I'm going to show you Emily the Beagle. There she is. Emily's not with us anymore. She went over the Rainbow Bridge about 4 years ago. But this was my favorite dog of all times. I've never had a dog like Emily. There was just, she and I got each other as much as a dog and a person can get each other. But this is my favorite picture of my favorite dog. And the reason is because this really characterizes who she was. She was a faithful dog. Every day she would wait at the door. If anybody was gone, she would be waiting when they returned. So if I was gone, she'd be at the door when I got home. If Mary Ann was gone, she'd be there. If the kids were out, she'd wait for the kids. And when we'd come home, she'd bark and she'd yell and she'd jump on us and she would love on us because she was a faithful dog. You know, most of you who have had a dog know what this is like because dogs are just faithful, right? Cats want to kill us. Dogs are faithful. Now here's the thing. When I think of faithfulness, I think of Emily because she was so faithful. But I'm not sure that a dog can give us a full picture of what it means to be a faithful person. All right? I think we need to understand that it's more than just a dog can give us. And so as I thought this week about what it means to be faithful, I thought, there's really three key elements to faithfulness. All right? There's three things that kind of work together, and here they are. Faithfulness requires a commitment in the past. It requires consistency in the present, and it requires to be continued in the future. That's faithfulness. Faithfulness is a commitment in the past. That's where it starts. So in marriage, this is obvious, right? That commitment is at the altar when you give your vows to one another and you make this commitment. And faithfulness means you stick to those vows. But maybe faithfulness can be in other places too. If you sign a contract with someone, or you make an agreement with someone, or you give your word to someone, faithfulness means you keep that. If you're a fan of a team, faithfulness means you keep rooting for the team that you chose. But it also means being consistent in the present. You see, if Emily just met us at the door one day, we'd say, oh, that was cute. That was nice. I'm so glad she was there. But we wouldn't say, oh, what a faithful dog. No, it's the fact that she does it over time. That consistency over time demonstrates faithfulness. Every day she is there. And what that means is that because we see her faithfulness in the present, we know it will continue in the future. And so we know that every day when we come home, Emily's going to be waiting for us, greeting us, faithful. Faithfulness starts in the past with a commitment. It continues in the present as we're consistent day after day, and it continues into the future. That's what faithfulness is. And I think if we really want to understand God's faithfulness, this is what it looks like. This is God's faithfulness to us. Think about God's promises, his commitments in the past. In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve have sinned. And God comes to the garden to talk to them and explain to them, hey, you guys have really messed up. And here's the results of that. But mixed into that passage, there's this two-line phrase that he says, and he's actually talking to the serpent, and he says to the serpent, look, for the rest of time, you and the woman are going to be at odds, and you and her seed are going to be at odds, and you will strike his heel, the seed of the woman, but he will crush your head. That's a promise from God to us. It's a promise that, you know what, we're always going to endure the evil one biting at our heels. And even the ultimate seed of the woman, Jesus, experienced the biting at the heel because the serpent thought he won when he crucified the Son of God. But then Jesus rose again, and he crushed the head of the serpent because Jesus is faithful to his promises. God called Abraham up out of his land and said, Abraham, I'm going to take you and I'm going to have you move somewhere else. And I've got some promises for you. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to make a great nation from your descendants. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. And God was faithful to that promise, right? Because we all know who Abraham is. And we all know that his descendants are still around today and are not just one great nation, but many great nations. And we all know that the ultimate descendant of Abraham, Jesus, is the one through whom all people on earth are blessed. Because God keeps his promises. He's faithful. And we could keep going through the Old Testament with this, right? Moses said, I can't go to Pharaoh. I don't know how to talk. And God said, I will give you the words. I will take care of you. And he gave Moses 10 plagues to come down on Egypt until Pharaoh finally said, no more, go. Joshua was nervous before going into the promised land. And God came to him and said, be strong and courageous because I will be with you. And he was with him. And Joshua was successful and he did conquer the land. David said to God, God, I want to build you a house. And God said, David, tell you what, I don't want you to build me a house. I have a promise for you. I'm going to build you a house. It's going to be a line of kings that will last into eternity. And we know that that's King Jesus who will rule forever. Isaiah the prophet came to the king of Israel at a really dark time and said, look, God has a promise for you. The virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, for he will save his people from their sins. And we know that was fulfilled in Matthew. And Jesus was born to the Virgin Mary, and Joseph said, we will call his name Emmanuel. You see, God keeps his promises. God has always kept his promises. He is faithful in the past. And what that means is we can trust him to keep his promises in the future. So in the New Testament, when we see some of the promises of God, we know he will be faithful. When he says, I will never leave you or forsake you, we know he'll be faithful to that. When he says, I will supply all your needs according to my riches, we know he'll be faithful to that. When he said to his disciples, I'm going away to prepare a place for you, that where I am you can also be, we know he'll be faithful to that. When he says everything's going to end at the end of time in Revelations, but behold, I am making all things new, we know he'll be faithful to that. You see, that's how it works with God. We've seen his faithfulness in the past. We see his consistency in the present. We know he will be faithful in the future. Here's the best part about God's faithfulness. God is faithful because he chooses to be, not because we deserve it. You know that's true, right? None of us deserve God's faithfulness. All of us are faithless at times. All of us have messed up. All of us have let him down. None of us deserve his faithfulness. 2 Timothy 2 says, if we are faithless, he is faithful. There's a great picture of this in one of Jesus' stories, the parable of the prodigal son. You remember this story, right? There's this man, and he's got two sons. And one of the sons comes to his father and says, Dad, I want you to give you everything that you owe me. I want you to think about that just for a minute. If you're a parent, one of your kids comes to you, says, Dad, give me everything you owe me. You're like, I don't owe you a blessed thing. You owe me your life. Right? But this dad doesn't say that. He says, you know what? Okay, when I die, this is what you're supposed to get, so I'll give it to you now. Here you go. And the son takes his inheritance, he converts it into cash, and he runs off to a foreign land where he goes crazy, wild living, spends everything, eventually finds himself homeless, so he starts living in a pigsty, eating the pig food. And as he's laying there in the mud, sharing the pig food with the bacon, he thinks to himself, I should go home. And I know that I don't deserve to be a son anymore. I've kind of squandered that, but maybe my dad would let me be his servant. And if I'm his servant, at least I'll have a roof over my head and food on my table. So the son begins his journey home, not to be a son, but to be a servant, because he knows he does not deserve to be a son. As he gets close to home, the father's looking out and he sees his son return. And what does he do? Puts his hands in his pocket, stomps his feet. I can't believe that kid's coming back. If he thinks he's getting one more thing, he is so wrong. He doesn't deserve anything. I'm throwing him out. Is that what the father said? Would it have been justified? Yeah. Is that what the son deserved? Absolutely. But what does the father do? He runs to his son. He opens his arms. He embraces him. He said, "My son, you're home. Kill the fatted calf. We're having steak. We're having a party because my son who was lost has been found." That's faithfulness. That's our Father. That's our God. He is faithful to us when we are not faithful to him. So understand this. If God is faithful to me, even when I don't deserve it, that means I ought to be faithful in my life, even when I don't feel like it. This has a lot of applications, doesn't it? I ought to be faithful in my marriage, even when I don't feel like it. I ought to be faithful at work to my commitments there, even when I don't like what's going on. I need to be faithful to my family. I need to be faithful to my friends. I need to be faithful to God, even when life goes somewhere I didn't want it to go. It is so easy to let the cares of this life choke out our faith. Jesus told a story about that too, didn't he? Remember the parable of the sower? Man goes out and he starts throwing seeds all over the place. And some of the seeds land on the road, and some of them land in rocks. Some of them land near thorns, and some of them land in good ground. And the seeds that land in the good ground, they sprout right up. But the seeds on the path, nothing happens to them. The birds eat them. But in the rocks and in the thorns, the seeds start to grow, but eventually they die because they don't have roots and they get choked out by the thorns. And Jesus interprets the parable to his disciples, and he says, this is what it means. The seeds that fell on the rocks, they started to grow, but they died because they had no roots. And the seeds that got choked out by thorns, that represents the people who are doing really well. They accept the message at first, and they believe at first, and they're doing really well, but then they get choked out by what? The cares of life. I don't like where life is going. I don't like what life is doing to me, and so I'm not going to be faithful anymore. But Jesus says the seed that falls in the good ground, that is faithful, that grows, it produces fruit. It multiplies. You see what Jesus is saying is when we are faithful, our lives produce fruit. The faithful life produces fruit. Let me show you another verse about faithfulness. This is in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23. It says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful." This is a great verse. It's about faithfulness, and you see that it's really saying because God is faithful, we should be faithful. What does it mean to hold fast to something? To hold on tight, to refuse to let go. And here the verse is saying, refuse to let go of what? The confession of your hope. This is a forward-focused statement. It's saying that, look, your faith, your faithfulness is rooted in something that hasn't happened yet. It's rooted in your belief about the future. It's rooted in your expectation of God's provision. You see, to understand faithfulness, we have to understand who God is, and we have to understand what Jesus has done. And so that's why if you back up a couple verses from here, the author of Hebrews tells us, hey, look, you need to understand what Jesus has done. Jesus has given you access to God the Father. He says, we can now boldly go before God. We can take our requests to him. We can take our concerns to him, our hurts, our pains, our sorrows. We can go to him directly. We don't have to go through a priest. We don't have to go through a sacrificial system. We go straight to him because when Jesus died, he broke down the barrier between us and God. But it also says that Jesus is our high priest, that he's our priest on our behalf, which means this: Jesus is with the Father right now saying good things about us. Because when we give our life to him, he gives us his perfection, and he goes to the Father and says, hey, these guys are mine. They're mine. Treat them well. Take care of them. He's our advocate. So here's the thing. Faithfulness is rooted in my understanding of who God is and what Christ has done for me. And that means that I can be faithful in the present because I'm not afraid of the future. I don't know what's coming tomorrow. And you don't know what's coming tomorrow. That can be terrifying. Maybe you do know what's coming tomorrow, and that's more terrifying. Maybe you are looking down the road and you see something coming. You say, I don't think I can handle that. Faithfulness is when we say, wait a minute, I'm lying to myself. Because what is it that God has promised? I will never leave you or forsake you. Whatever I walk through tomorrow, he's walking through with me. What else has he promised? I will meet all your needs. And that means that no matter where I go, no matter where life takes me, he's walking through, and he has already decided that he can make good out of whatever happens. He has already decided that he can take what comes and give me what I need, even if I can't see it. And his faithfulness in the past and his consistency in the present means I can trust him in the future. So faithfulness means I lean on that. No matter what comes tomorrow, he's got me in his hands. Let me read one more verse here, because it's kind of the follow-up, and it's really important. It says this: let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, when you first see this verse, it doesn't seem to really fit the last verse. It's like, wait, it's kind of a start and a stop. There's not a lot of connection here. This guy's jumping from one thought to another, right? No, these are perfectly connected, because here's the thing. When we are faithful to God, we will be faithful to others. When we are faithful to him, we'll be faithful in our other relationships. All of us have relationships in which we are called to be faithful. The marriage relationship, the parenting, the child relationship, work relationships, friendships, whatever it may be, we are all called to be faithful in our relationships. And what we see here is that when I'm faithful to God, when I'm willing to rely on him in the present because I know he's in control of the future, that's going to spill into my other relationships. And this verse says, look, let us consider, because we're being faithful, let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good works. This is a great phrase. Stir one another up to love and good works. You may know that I like coffee, and I like Starbucks. I like my coffee black, just black coffee, espresso, Americano, whatever. I don't like anything else in it. But Marianne has a special drink. It's called a mocha misto. And what that means is it's a cafe misto, which is kind of coffee and milk, steamed milk, with mocha in it. And then she likes whip on it too. So her drink is at night, she gets it decaf. So it's a decaf mocha misto with whip. Really simple, right? Now, sometimes the baristas get it right, and sometimes they get it really wrong. And here's how they get it wrong. When they make the coffee, they put the steamed milk into the coffee, and then they put the mocha in. And they pump, mocha comes out into the drink, and then they put the top on and push it out the window. And the problem is then all that chocolatey goodness, it stays clumped up, and it just sinks to the bottom. And now what you essentially have is just steamed milk and coffee, and you can't taste any of the mocha, the chocolate, because it's stuck to the bottom of the cup. You see, the ones who get it right, what do? They stir it up. And this magical thing happens when they stir it up. The mocha is released. It's mobilized. It's empowered to infuse the entire drink with chocolatey goodness. And it turns what's just kind of an icky coffee and milk drink into an amazing chocolate and coffee drink. Why? Because it got stirred up. Now get this. This is what we're called to do. We are called to stir one another to good works, to help each other release the goodness in us, to mobilize one another, to empower one another, to go out and infuse the world, not with chocolatey goodness, but with God's goodness. And so faithful people are people who are stirring each other up. That's why in Hebrews it says this, don't stop meeting together. We meet together so we can stir each other up. We meet together so we can stir each other to good works, so we can mobilize and empower each other so that when we leave, we'll be faithful in all of our relationships, encouraging each other, stirring each other up. A faithful person stirs those around them to love and good works. Now, can you see how this works in your relationships? And as a parent, you ought to be stirring your children to good works. And even as a child, you can stir your parents to good works. You have commitments in the workplace. You ought to be stirring your coworkers, your boss, your employees to good works. And obviously, in the marriage relationship, if you're being faithful to one another, what are you doing? You're stirring each other up to love and good works. I want us to be a church full of people who are constantly stirring and being stirred to do God's good works in His world. I want us to be a church that is constantly stirring up our community to love and good works. I want that because I want us to be faithful. He's been so faithful to us, and He will be so faithful to us. And our faithfulness begins there, when we're willing to remind ourselves constantly of God's faithfulness to us so that we can be faithful to Him and to one another. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for Jesus' willingness to come and make us right with you, to cover our imperfections with His perfection. I pray that you will stir us up to your love and your good works, so that we will stir up one another to love and good works as well. Help us to be faithful people in every walk of life. In your name, amen.